Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the 10 Best Payer Contracting Practices webinar. This session is being brought to you by Healthcents Inc., and my name is Steve Selpst, and I'm the CEO and co-owner of Healthcents Inc. Let me begin by mentioning that this is a recorded session, and there will be opportunities throughout the session for your participation. So thank you for joining, and I am very confident that over the course of the next 60 minutes that you will be given a number of different ideas which you can put to work immediately in enabling your practice or your company to obtain more profitable payer contracts. Thank you again for joining. I am as well joined up by Regina Vasquez, who is the Senior VP of Accounts at Healthcents Inc., and she will be helping me moderate throughout this session, including taking your questions throughout the session, and we'll explain how you can go about asking those questions in just a moment. I did want to spend a minute to introduce you to Healthcents Inc. for those of you that are working with Healthcents here today for the first time, and also to let you know about a new service that we're providing. But anyhow, Healthcents has been in business now for over 20 years, and our main business is enabling medical providers to obtain more profitable payer contracts through both the analysis of payer contracts and through the actual negotiations of these contracts. We have enabled practices of every size and shape and companies of every size and shape to obtain more profitable contracts, often in excess of 10 to 20% per year and 5 to 6x or even higher in terms of return on investment. So our business is the business of enabling more revenue into your practice. And the goal today is to bottle up many of the techniques that we deploy when you outsource these services to a company like Healthcents, to also enable you to be able to put these kinds of techniques to work and resulting in more profitable payer contracts and in a manner that is going to work for you and, for that matter, work for the payer. So we'll talk about that. We also do general healthcare consulting to a variety of industries, including one of our key clients currently is Staples.com, and we do quite a bit of work for Staples in the area of enabling information such as regulation updates for that organization. Most recently, we've introduced a new product line, which I'm really excited about, which we call online digital marketing. And what this enables is that if you're looking to market your practice or your company, both in your locality and across the country, we actually will do everything from tuning your website by enabling more content that will be found on search engines for optimization. We will also do social media deployment and basically wrap together a complete communication plan, including electronic emails out to customers and customer prospects, that sort of thing. And what's different about what we're doing in this area than a lot of the technical companies that you might come across doing this service is that because we have the expertise in healthcare, in negotiating contracts, we're able to actually do the content generation versus having you do the content generation and then just deploying it for you. So that's really a unique service, and it goes hand in glove with the notion of enabling more profit on contracts. So I'm very excited to tell you about that service, as well as today to introduce you to the techniques of contract negotiation, including utilizing software such as the Healthcents Revolution software product to better assess patterns in your contracts, to detect under reimbursement, and to enable new revenue streams. We also package up a course called the Blueprint for Success that basically is a 6-hour-long version split into 4 different sessions that goes into all of the details and the nuts and bolts of the techniques that we're going to be talking about today. So all this information can be found at healthcents.com. And without further ado, that's who I am. You'll see me with my orange internet tie in most of the venues when you look for us online. What I want to start with regard to today's session is to talk a little bit about the revenue cycle and to really provide a perspective about where payer contracts analytics fits into the revenue cycle. Now, virtually every practice at some level deploys practice management tools, billing software. Obviously, you have to do coding, you have to do collections, you have to keep cash and scheduling, all of those activities flowing through your practice. But some practices, pretty much either take payer contracts at face value and don't renegotiate them, or don't really apply sophisticated techniques that are consistent with the payer's techniques. So as a result, the practice is under reimbursed on their payer contracts. When you consider the payer contracts represent as much as 50%, commercial payer contracts represent as much as 50% or more of the reimbursement in a typical practice or medical provider, really is important to have the techniques in place to optimize these contracts so that ultimately you complete the revenue cycle and you enable as much profit as you possibly can for your practice. So the context today is that we're going to focus on payer contracts analysis and negotiations so that you can effectively maximize your reimbursement. This is just another way of looking at the revenue cycle and where payer contracts analysis and negotiations fit. But the questions that one should ask in this area is, are my reimbursements being maximized for selected agreements? Am I better off in-network or out-of-network? Are the terms favorable? Is my charge master set high enough? And the often forgotten step is, am I being paid correctly once the contract is in place relative to contracted rates? So we're going to dive into answering all of those questions in today's session. The goals are going to be to actually evaluate a managed care fee proposal. We're going to do a SWOT analysis, which is the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, so that you can characterize your practice's reimbursements in terms of where the strengths are in your fee schedules, where the weaknesses are, and for that matter, do the same in the context of marketing your practice to employer groups and to beneficiaries. We're also going to go through a simulated managed care reimbursement proposal and look at exactly how you can go about benchmarking and doing in versus out of network assessments, bill charges modeling to make sure that your charge masters are set at a high enough UCR threshold relative to local Medicare rates. And we're going to talk about how to build an agreement that results in a win-win, and really a win-win-win, which is ultimately a win for your patients or customers. It's a win for you, and it really can be a win for the payer as well. And those are the best kinds of agreements when everybody wins. So that's what we shoot for. And we're going to talk about monitoring and how you go about making sure that you do an audit on a regular basis of your EOBs to make sure that your claims are being paid for correctly relative to the contracted rates that you have with the payer. And we're going to talk about some of the surrounding language, the operational language that is often buried in a payer contract that can affect the reimbursement terms. Things such as lesser bill charge versus the contracted rates, things such as how long you have to file claims or how long the payer has to pay claims and so forth. And then we're going to talk about ACOs and MACRA and the evolution of value-based contracting. So that is becoming an increasingly important part of this equation. And I think it's important in that way that we cover the aspects that are evolving on the reimbursement landscape. The goal here ultimately is to enable more money to flow into your practice from these commercial payer agreements. So I'm going to start off here with a question, and I really want to dissect this for you in terms of getting to the right answer here and why it's really important off the bat for you to understand the answer to this question. So what is the question? Well, let's just say we have two codes. One of them is a 58140. It's paid at 80% of Medicare, and that's for simplicity, including the patient copayment and any coinsurance. It's paid at $1,000 a service. And then we have the office visit code 99213, paid at a higher percent of Medicare, and that's at $60 a service. And the volume on 58140 is 100, So that's frequency performed over a year for that service. And then for the office visit, the frequency over that same period of time is 1,000. And so the question here is you can get a 20% increase on one or the other of these codes, but not both. So which one should you accept the increase on and why? Okay. So again, two different codes, all you're presented with are the statistics here, and you have to make a decision. Now, to expedite this part of the discussion, I will answer this for you and explain, but I want to do this slowly and probably even use this as a jumping point into the next session. But the answer, by the way, here is going to be 58140. Now, there's a couple of interesting facts that I'd like to point out as to why this is the answer. First off, this is really a question designed to immediately have you hone your focus when you're assessing payer contracts and reimbursement rates into the revenue that flows on the services that you're providing. A lot of practices will jump into assessing reimbursement strictly based on the percent of local Medicare rates. So that might have deceived you here, where you thought maybe code 99213, for example, which is paid at 90% of Medicare, would have been a better one to get the increase on than 58140. But actually, in this context of which one would you want more money on, it's a revenue-based answer. So the percent of Medicare in this case is completely irrelevant. Now, it's relevant in the context of, is the code reimbursed at a reasonable rate compared to what it should be reimbursed at? But that's a different question. Here we're talking about how do you maximize revenue when presented with a choice of two different codes. So in that context, if you take it's really a very simple equation of the volume times the rate reimbursed for the code. So if we look at that, then for 58140, the rate reimbursed is 1,000, and the frequency or volume is 100, so that's 100,000 of revenue, whereas the rate for 99213 is 60 a service, and it's performed 1,000 times. Well, that's 60,000. 60,000, of course, is less than 100,000. Therefore, if I can get a 20% increase on 100,000, I'm obviously better off than if I can get a 20% increase on 60,000 of revenue, and that's why we select 58140. But this is a really important point to take away, because a lot of times, even when this kind of assessment is being done, I find practices may just look at the volume in isolation or perhaps the rates in isolation, and you really shouldn't do that. When you talk about code importance, the importance of a code is defined by its revenue contribution to your overall portfolio of services, and that's what you want to hone in on. So very important to take that point away from here. Now, in the context of 10 best practices, sometimes it's best to break 10 things down into 3, because it's a lot easier for the mind to consume 3 things. So I'm going to help you off the bat by defining the processes in payer contract negotiations and paring it down into 3 specific steps. The first, and perhaps arguably the most important, is actually the preparation that goes into contract negotiations, getting all of your contracts together, assessing the fee schedules, determining what you should be asking for, preparing the proposal letter, and then commencing the negotiation. That's where at least 50% of the effort goes. And then we actually commence the negotiation, and hopefully it results in that handshake to the right and doesn't have too much of that arm wrestling. And then, as I mentioned, one of the most important steps is, once a contract is actually in place, to monitor the claims payments against the contracted rates to ensure payment accuracy. And there are a number of reasons why payments may diverge, actual payments may diverge from your contracted rates. For example, in almost every payer contract nowadays, you will see a clause that says that you get reimbursed the lesser of the contracted rate or the bill charge. So this means that if your charge master is set at a threshold is below your contracted rates, then you will actually get reimbursed at your bill charge and not get your contracted rate. So that's a case where you may look in the mirror and figure out that you're responsible for getting reimbursed less than you negotiated on a payer contract, and you need therefore to get better hygiene in terms of your charge master being set at high enough UCR thresholds. So there are a lot of different reasons why payments may differ from contracted rates, but the point is to get in there and do that monitoring to be sure that, in fact, you are paid accurately. We don't want that the result to be like that to the right. The contracts negotiation process, therefore, now we can kind of peel the onion back and from these three major areas of preparing, negotiating, monitoring, and kind of pair it into specific steps, which we can walk through. And that's how we get to kind of the 10 best practices approach. So we're going to talk about data analysis, proposal letter preparation, making that initial contact and how to get the payer on the hook, how that iterative negotiation takes place and how you get to a result. And then if you can't get to a desirable result, let's talk about the timing of escalation and other options that can be considered, such as out-of-network considerations, being a non-par provider, and then also making sure that part of the process is going to be renegotiating contracts and monitoring claims. So we're going to step through all of this in quick fashion over the course of the next 45 minutes or so. Now, I will mention that if you would like to ask a question, I will open the lines up for questions, and you'll be able to do that at different junctures in the course of the next 45 minutes or so. And when I do that, simply press *6 on your phone to ask a question, and then when you're done conversing, press *6 again, and you'll be done. Also, you can write this down. You can send us an email at any time beginning right now to info, I-N-F-O, at healthcents.com. That's info, I-N-F-O, at healthcents, like you see spelled here at the bottom of the page, .com. So if you'd like to ask a question and you prefer to just send it to us, Regina here will pick it up instantly at info at healthcents.com. And she will turn around and ask that question for you if that's your preferred method. I really like it when you jump in and ask live questions, so I appreciate it when you do, but also like it when you send emails so that we can make sure to answer your questions that way. So the context of the 10 best practices, now we can take the prepare stage and break it into evaluating top codes and figuring out which ones are driving the revenue. That was the point to the very first question that I asked you about 58140 and 99213 and why we determined that 58140 was the more important code to get the increase on because it was driving more revenue. So we'll go through how to do this across a portfolio of codes. We'll do some benchmarking relative to Medicare rates and to rates that other providers may be getting for and rates that you may be getting across your agreements as well to figure out how to drive revenue. We'll talk about the 20/80 rule, which is really about making sure that you focus on the 20% of your codes that drive the 80% plus of the revenue. One of the cumbersome parts of assessing payer fee schedules is they often have 300 to 500 plus codes, but all but maybe 20 to 25 of those codes may only account for 5 to 20% of your revenue. So what you really want to do is focus on the 20 to 25 codes, whatever that small number is, that drive the preponderance of your revenue, because those are the ones that are going to ultimately swing payer contracts in your favor. And you'll see that there's a lot of arithmetic ways to portray fee schedules where payers may accurately state they're giving you an increase on a fee schedule when it's an average increase across 300 codes, 290 of which you don't really care about because they hardly drive any revenue. So you really need to have a good feel for which codes are driving the revenue and how that fits relative to negotiations that you embark on with payers. We'll go through the SWOT analysis that I spoke about, both in terms of fee schedules and positioning your practice. I'll actually give you a template and take you through it for preparing proposal letters. And then we're going to simulate a quick contract negotiation and talk about different ways to optimize the offers, review contract language and pick out the things that are most important to look for, and then finally make sure that that monitoring step is in place to ensure that payments are accurate and that you're not being under reimbursed relative to contracted rates. Before I embark on the specific steps, this is a good point to pause for any questions. So Regina, I would ask you please to hit asterisk 43 so that you can open up the lines. Okay, and for those who would like to ask a question, please simply press asterisk 6 right now on your phone and ask your question. Okay, going once, going twice. Don't have any live ones on this first part. So I will ask Regina at info@Healthcents, do we have any questions that have come in at this point?
Not right now.
Okay, none yet in the preliminary
None
stage.
yet.
So,
right, in this very first section, we don't have any just yet.
I'm sorry, for some reason, Regina, it's can't hear you so well. Can you get up closer to the mic or phone? Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and
Steve,
take
I'm
a look
sorry.
then.
I had my phone muted.
Oh, okay.
I had my phone muted. I am sorry.
Much better.
I was being diligent about not having background noise disrupt the disrupt the presentation, so I do apologize.
All right. Well, now we can hear you perfectly. So I think I heard you say there weren't any questions just yet. Is that right?
No questions have come through just yet.
Okay, thank you. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of the matter here. So the first thing that you want to do is get a hold of your fee schedule and put it into this kind of a format. Now, I'm using, I always like to use tools that can do work for me and do it accurately. So we use a product called Revolution software, which, by the way, was announced yesterday that Staples.com is selling this through their Quill.com website now. So you can actually order it there at a very low price, $19.99 per physician per month. But in any event, you can also do this in a spreadsheet. And what you want to do is, okay, Regina, just put it back into presentation mode. What you want to do is load up the codes that are driving the 80% plus of your revenue, first off. So that's, represented by this small set of codes here. And then what you want to do is spin the codes in a manner that the revenue is the driving factor. So you do a descending sort by revenue. And again, the revenue is a function of the contracted rate in this case times the volume. So the codes that are producing the most revenue come to the top of the list. And this way, when you start to assess which codes would you want to drive an increase on, now you have a clear view that the codes that are at the top of the list are the ones that are going to contribute the most to any incremental changes relative to increases in your contracted rate. So another way you want to spin this too is once you have it in a sortable spreadsheet or in a product like Revolution software, sort it by procedure, because common groups of procedures also have the same code ranges. So 99 XXX codes are office visits, for example. You're going to find that laparoscopies are in a 5.8 range, and you have labs and pathology codes. Labs are usually 8,000 range codes, and so forth. So the point is to be able to look for code groups and specific codes that may be under reimbursed. So in this example, we spun it by a descend revenue sort. So we have the code, we have the revenue as the main sort, we have the percent Medicare, which is a function of the payer rate divided by the Medicare rate. And interestingly, we catalog in this tool benchmarks, which will also show you which codes may be under reimbursed from a Medicare perspective. So what I circled are the codes that, in this example, would be great candidates if you had to pick specific codes to drive incremental revenue on. Now, I picked 99213 for a couple of reasons. One is it's at the top of the list. It's our biggest revenue producing code. And the second reason is that it also appears to be under reimbursed. It's at 66% roughly of Medicare compared to regional or Medicare locality averages of 94%, state averages of 93, and national average of 91. So it's good, 25 points under from a percent Medicare perspective, other benchmarks that we have. So this would be an excellent candidate, both in terms of its revenue contribution, as well as the fact that it's under reimbursed. And that's really the goal here, is to detect these under reimbursed codes and code patterns and hone in on those specific codes, unless you're fortunate enough that the payer is going to give you just an across the board increase, which nowadays is becoming a bit more rare than in the past. So we pick that code, and then we kind of go down the list and pick some other codes here. This case of 59400, well, it's at a much higher percent relative to benchmarks, but because it's at the top of our list, we're going to try to drive revenue up on that code and kind of take it down to our top 3 or 4 codes, and then we go further down the list and we start looking for the combination of codes that still drive a fair amount of revenue, but at the same time are reimbursed at a percent Medicare that's below benchmark. So we isolated some more codes for illustrative purposes. So that's how we came up with that selection, and I'll show you in a moment, how we can devise then a proposal back to the payer that will now drive revenue in the right places. But before I do that, I want to point out another fact here that you may or may not have noticed, but you'll notice it now. And that is, there's a very dramatic difference in the average rate of Medicare in this scenario versus the weighted average percent Medicare. Notice the weighted average is only at 92% of Medicare overall, whereas the average is at 108%. And the first key point about that statistic is that you always want to hone in on weighted averages and not just work with averages, because by the nature of an average, we all know that it counts the number of items that you're averaging, and that becomes the denominator, and the values that are averaged become the numerator, and that means that everything is counted equally. Well, we already said that codes that have more revenue therefore derive more importance from a reimbursement perspective, and what the weighted average does is it focuses the reimbursement on those codes that drive the most revenue, because what the calculation of a weighted average is it takes the volume for each code that you're assessing times the payer rate. So volume times payer rate, in the case of 99213, it'd be 1,500 times 50. And it adds the next row, volume for 59400, 24, times payer rate, 2756, 25. And it keeps doing that for all the codes that you're assessing, adds them all up. So it's the sum of the volume times the payer rates for each code, makes that the numerator. And then it takes the volume times the Medicare payment for each code, once again, makes that the denominator, and it does that division, and voila, what it comes out is that when you weight the reimbursement based on the revenue importance of the code, you see you're actually getting reimbursed substantially less than an average. And where this becomes very critical to you in a payer contract negotiation is, more often than not, payers, through their actuarial assessment, they have some very smart people that set their fee schedules. They will work with averages and show you how you may be getting an increase across an entire fee schedule, which, it's not that it's not true, but, the beauty is in the eye of the beholder when it comes to payer fee schedules. And if you're the payer, the goal is to pay you less. And if you're a provider, the goal is to get more money. And so the payer is going to present their case in the manner that works best for them, which is going to be to show you that your overall fee schedule may be going up when you count 300 codes and do an average. But the fact of the matter is, if you have 10 or 20 codes or 30 that are driving the preponderance of your revenue, and those codes are under reimbursed, then that will not stand out when you do an average calculation, but it certainly will stand out when you do a weighted average calculation. So the point is, the best practice here is always do weighted average calculations and compare them to the average, because the weighted average is going to give you a true picture of what your reimbursement is. And I can tell you unequivocally, where we've done, literally thousands of these assessments over and over again on a regular basis, almost always it looks something like this, where the weighted average, not surprisingly, is substantially below the average. And unless you go through the effort to do that arithmetic, taking the volumes times the contracted rates for every single code, every single important code, your top 20% of the codes driving 80+% of revenue, and divide it by the sum of the Medicare rates times the volume, unless you do that to get your weighted average, then you really don't know what your effective reimbursement is, and you'll end up even thinking that you're getting an increase and agreeing to a fee schedule, only to find out that you're getting a decrease because the codes that drove the most revenue didn't get moved up enough. So this is a very, very critical stage in the assessment and should always be done upfront before you even think about commencing a payer contract negotiation. Now, by way of example, I took those codes that we talked about before that were circled, and I devised a new fee schedule, the one that we're going to offer back to the payer, which is that we want our E&M codes to go up 40%, because we saw that our top revenue producing code was 99213 and it was very under reimbursed. So the others will come along for the ride as well. Then we took some of these specific codes that were also under reimbursed or were top revenue producers, raised them by 25%. And then the rest of the codes that were in the list, still in our top 20%, if you will, we took up by 10%. And now let's take a look at what would happen then if the payer were to agree to that. So what we do here now is we basically remodel that fee schedule that we saw a moment ago. And what we do here is we basically now compare with those revisions that I just mentioned, what the new fee schedule would look like, code by code, making those changes to the current fee schedule that we first looked at. And you can see by carving it up in that manner and comparing these blue items, the delta representing the various increases using those business rules that we just defined, you can see that we can drive up revenue about $88K on a 408K base. And that at least gives you a basis now to negotiate from. And now if the payer starts coming back and says, well, I can't quite go that high on an office visit code, but I can go this high, now at least you've got the discussion working for you. And the focus on that negotiation now is in the parts of the fee schedule that are going to have a real substantive effect on your reimbursement. Now, the other aspect is that there are certain agreements, and every practice is different in this regard, but there are certain agreements where you can consider potentially being a non-par provider and going out of network. Maybe it's because the volume is low relative to other agreements in terms of patient flow. Maybe it's the revenue is low, or maybe it's both. Or maybe you're in a demographic, you have a demographic in your area where you believe that you're going to be able to collect cash from almost all of your current patient base. So you really have to, kind of consider the scenario, because I have some practices that say unequivocally they don't want to go out of network no matter what on any agreement. Others that are, kind of moderate in that regard and say, well, maybe, in these three that are not my largest, one or two or three agreements, yeah, I'll consider it on those, but not on my top two or three agreements. And then you have other practices, that I've actually seen go in the extreme, where they, go 100% out of network. So, you have all different cases here. But the point is, when you consider an out of network decision, I'd like to see you do it in a manner that's not just pure and unequivocal emotion or rage against the payer, where you can shoot yourself in the foot, but rather, apply some analytics to it so that you know what the financial impact of your decision is. And that's what the goal is of this kind of an assessment. So what we do here is we essentially look at a few variables. The ones that matter here in this model are going to be, first and foremost, what percent of your business from a revenue, this is a revenue-based model, so I'm not, taking into account, costs or net profit per procedure, but on a revenue basis, what percent might you lose going out of network? So I default that to 30. I can, certainly ratchet it up. And of course, the more that we lose going out of network, it's an inverse relationship to the revenue, in network, because the in-network view is going to get better and better as we lose more patients going out of network. So we might want to run a best, medium, and worst case, but in this case, we plugged a 30%. And let's say that's a medium case for those that, the percent of our revenue base that might go out of network relative to patient revenue. Then we say, okay, if more people go out of network, if I'm in an out of network situation, obviously my staff has to process more individual claims, and it's already hard enough to collect on claims individually from patients with, higher deductibles and co-insurance and co-payments under some of the new plans that have emerged. But now it's going to get even harder because I don't really have, any contract in place with the payer, so all of my revenue now has to get collected from patients. That's going to tax us about 10% more in administrative staff time. So that's what that's about. And then the 100% is here just saying that you've accounted for all the revenue. We put that here because of the 20/80 rule that I mentioned. So if you'd accounted for 80% of the revenue, that number would become 80. But anyway, the bill charge discount rate, that's the other key, one of the other key variables. So a lot of practices have a standard where for cash-based patients, they're charged a 80% of bill charge rate. So clearly when we appropriate our out-of-network revenue, we need to apply that 80% factor against our bill charge and reduce it accordingly to account for the discount. And then similarly, on the flip side of the equation, if we increase our in-network revenue by a percentage, then we want to account for that increase. So if we think, payers already agreed to a 10% increase, we can change that 0 to 10%. Here I'm modeling a baseline. It says my current fee schedule as it stands now with no increase. How does it compare to an out-of-network scenario with a 30% patient attrit, a little 10% tax on the staff, and a 20% discount of bill charges? And voila, we get an answer. It says, okay, with those variables, we're about $145K, $146K, worse off in network. So this favors the out-of-network scenario. And then we get the detail below by code. So the point is we can model this real time and then decide, if it's an agreement where we would indeed consider an out-of-network scenario, let's figure out what our risk is by doing this sort of modeling. And that's what I mean by SWOT analysis of in versus out-of-network scenarios is take a look at the financial implications of this kind of a decision. Similarly, one of the common issues that we see is that we often see that charge masters are not audited on a regular basis, and as a result, they can fall behind inflationary factors, even though right now we're in a period of pretty low inflation, but over the years, if this goes on long enough, even at 1 to 2% inflation, sooner or later, your contracted rates may be going up. And if your bill charges are left behind and suddenly your bill charges are in effect lower than your contracted rates, then you run the risk of being paid less than your contracted rates. So one of the things you want to model then is picking a UCR threshold, say at 250% of Medicare. The idea is then to flag those codes where the reimbursement is below the 250% threshold. That's represented by the middle section here. And then the far right column looks at those codes where the bill charge is less than the contracted rate. And that's an immediate need then to get the charge master updated to at least that level, but actually really should be higher, should be up to that 250% level. But the last thing you want to do is leave money on the table where your contracted rate or your bill charge is, less than your contracted rate as it is in, in this first code $5,900. So you want to clean up that charge master, because what's happening is you're actually not getting your contracted rate on the code, and you certainly don't want that to be the case. So doing a charge master audit is definitely a key part of the equation. And what you find too is even if a small percentage of your revenue is out of network revenue in your practice, just by making these sorts of adjustments to the charge master can often drive new revenue into the practice just by cleaning up the charge master. And that's really what we mean by, let's get good charge master hygiene in place and, do the appropriate SWOT analysis and adjustments. Now that leads us to another question. And in this case, we're talking about a merger. Today, mergers are extremely common and getting more common, both in hospital systems and large independent practices. So I thought it was apropos to look at what happens when you merge. And we've worked with a lot of clients who have merged and have brought to the table differing fee schedules and have tried to reconcile those fee schedules in a way that's going to result in more revenue. So here's the scenario. We have a practice A that makes $1 million prior to the merger, and their overall reimbursement rate is about 100% of Medicare, using weighted averages, of course. And then practice B, prior to the merger, had about $200K, so they're the smaller of the two merging practices, and they were getting 120%, so they had a better fee schedule in place with that payer. So now what's interesting is they're coming together and negotiating this agreement in practice C, which is now, practice C is the merger of practice A and B together. And so the payer has come back and saying, look, we will offer you 108% of Medicare. Well, that's great, obviously if you're practice A, but that isn't very good if you're practice B. Because, of course, the fee schedule for practice B compared to what they were getting goes down. So the question is, should you or should you not accept this offer from the payer? Is it a good deal or is it a bad deal? And what I would point out here is that first and foremost, if you're merging together different entities into a single tax ID, you certainly want to make sure that your incentive systems are set up to reward the participants in the new entity, in this case practice C, so that everybody shares in overall revenue upside. If you have not calibrated your merger to reward all of the participants in the merged entity, then problems will abound. And it may seem pretty basic that you would find a way to incentivize all members of a merged practice, but I can tell you that more often than not, we see that it's only after the fact that some of these issues are wrestled with. So what happens here? Should you take it or not? Well, yeah, you ought to take it, but here's why. Because the 8% increase on $1 million, see, that's going to, because the $1 million is so much larger, practice A was making so much more money, that's resulting in another $80K of revenue. On the other hand, the fact that 108% of Medicare is really 12% less of Medicare, 10% less for practice B, means that practice B in absolute terms goes down 20K, but practice A went up 80K. So yeah, you're better off by 60K in this example. Now, the thing is, there needs to be a way to allocate that money so that practice B benefits as well, because you're not going to have a very strong teamwork scenario going on if only practice A members are able to share in that increase. So one of the things I recommend is you take that $1 million, you add the 200K to it, you now consider the pool to be $1.2 million, and now just take the appropriation of revenue such that 200 divided by $1.2 million is X percent, and now divvy up that portion of the increased revenue, the 60K, to practice B and the larger portion to practice A, so that everybody shares proportionally in the increase. That's one example of how you reconcile this, but I've seen a lot of unfortunate situations where practices merge and they think, gee, happy days are here again because we had a smaller practice, getting 120% of Medicare and a larger one getting 100. We're going to go into the payer all guns blazing and make sure that everybody gets paid above that 120%. That's just not real world, folks. The payers, are just not going to give you the best rate of every single practice that merges, no matter what size they are. Now, realistically, what you can target is in a larger practice that has an influential role in servicing patients with a strong value proposition. You very likely will be able to drive revenue up overall on a weighted average basis across the merged entity, as we saw in this example. But there is going to be portions of the merged entity that go down and other portions that go up. And I would say it's kind of like for those of you that have 401ks or stock portfolios, things like that. You probably don't win on every single stock. If you do, I'd like to talk to you offline about it. But hopefully overall over a long period of time, you get some incremental improvement, and that's the idea here too. And it's you want to make sure that your weighted average reimbursement for the merged entity goes up over a period of time. Regina, I'll pause real quickly and then kind of blast through some of the rest of the material here. So go ahead and for questions. Actually, asterisk. And for those that would like to ask a question, simply press asterisk 6 on your phone right now, and then we'll take the online questions. So anybody have a live question? Okay. Regina, at info@Healthcents, what do we have?
Yes, we have a few questions. Several people are asking how to get charts after the webinar.
Okay. I will give you the URL at the end of the session, and you'll be able to instantly go to that URL to get charts. Next question.
Can you please re-explain the weighted average formula?
Okay. Excellent question, and thank you for asking. So the weighted average formula is you take the payer rate, the contracted rate, times the volume for each code, and you add them up. So, if I had a 99213, $100 per service done 10 times, that's $1,000. 58140 done 10 times at $1,000, that's $10,000. I add those two up, and then I get their Medicare rates for each one, multiplied by the volume for each, add them up, make that the denominator, and that is how I get the weighted average.
Okay. Another question is, do you have any tips for dealing with payers who have indicated that their fee schedules are non-negotiable?
Excellent question. So how do we deal with objections? And by the way, for anyone that would like to contribute any additional questions to the session, please at any time send an email to info at healthcense.com. So that's info@healthcense, the way you see it spelled here, .com. So how do we deal with a payer that says the fee schedule is frozen? Well, there's a number of options here. The first option is that we can essentially make a case that perhaps through our contribution to reduced hospital admissions and other statistics that improve care outcomes, that perhaps we should have a value-based component to our agreement. And if we meet certain metrics on an annual basis, we ought to be rewarded. Second thing we can do is also look at cost of living increases that suggest that maybe if we lock into a 3-year agreement, which could be beneficial for predictability, this is where win-win comes in play, both for the payer as well as for the practice, that we build slight graduated percent increases each year on top of the value base. So there may be a way to actually carve up or carve out increases on that basis, and also pick selected procedures that are especially beneficial to preventative care. Maybe you're using a Da Vinci robot to reduce prostate cancer readmissions and things of that nature. So those codes might be rewarded, or perhaps it's a matter of moving procedures to an office-based scenario versus a hospital or ASC scenario where the payer would also have to pay an additional facility fee. So there are a set of codes often that are candidates. If you can commit to do them in an office setting and you're equipped to do that, that can help. So these are all opportunities. Now, in the absence of all that working, it may be that an escalation needs to take place, but only after you have tried to work your way through the payer contracts negotiator and their immediate management team, should you be negotiating up to a senior executive. If you do that right from the get-go and do a tops-down approach, you basically take away your negotiating ability, because often what will happen is if you go right to a senior VP, they will point you right back at the contracts negotiator. And now when you do get stuck, potentially you won't have a way to go back. And then, of course, if worse comes to worse and you really detect that you're in an under-reimbursed situation, you can consider the out-of-network non-par scenario that we discussed. Regina, anything else you would add to that?
No, you have completely covered all of the bases.
Okay.
There is one final question. How do you calculate, or how did you calculate the regional average, state average, and national average? And I believe they're referring to the benchmark report.
Yeah, very good. So that, just to point that out to folks, that was back on some of the examples that I gave, and thanks for asking that. Let me just go ahead and pull it up so everybody sees that again. So here in this report and others that I showed you regional, state, and national average. And the question is, where did that come from? In this case, I mentioned that we are using reports from a cloud-based service we call Revolution Software. Every time that a customer, a practice, a provider puts in statistics for what they get for 99213, for example, for any code, we catalog that. We don't reveal, of course, who the practice is, or for that matter, even who the payer is, but we essentially keep statistics for those that use this product. And then once we have 6 or more data points, in other words, 6 or more reported outcomes in that Medicare locality for a particular code, then we can actually provide you a regional average dollars. And again, that's based on those who use this tooling, but at least it gives you something to work with. And then you also get a state, which is a roll-up of all the regions in the state or localities in the state. And then you get a national, which of course is a roll-up of every outcome across the regions in the state. So it gives you at least something to work with in terms of comparing your reimbursement to the reimbursement that others who have reported outcomes get, so you have some feel for it. The other thing you can do as well is you can actually cross-compare your agreements in the same way that I showed you here, where you do a comparison of your actual payments and EOBs against your contracted rates and see if you're coming out higher or not. You can actually do the same thing and compare 2 payer agreements to each other and pick a primary payer or volume base that you then cross-compare the agreements on to get the order of magnitude difference on the revenue. You really need to pick the volumes of one payer or the other because, of course, if you start using the volume as a variable with different volumes for each of the 2 payers, then you convolute the results because the volume, could be outweighing the lower reimbursement or higher reimbursement, as the case may be. So you pick the common volume, and then you compare the rates across 2 payers. And you can also see among your own agreements which ones are substantially higher or lower, or you can aggregate all the payers together and do the same kind of comparison. All good questions. Thank you.
Okay, that wraps up the questions.
All right. So what I'm going to do is try to cover the salient points over the next 10 minutes or so. Thank you. Put it back in presentation mode just to prevent any background noise. I'm going to cover some salient points, and then we'll do another Q&A at the end here, but I want to really give everybody the full benefit. And this session I mentioned is recorded. So the other thing you'll be able to do is if you're not able to stick around for the ending part of this, you'll be able to go back at your leisure and view the recording as well as get a copy of the charts, which I mentioned I'll be sure to show you. In fact, for anybody that doesn't stick around, I probably should fast forward just so you have that information right now, since I know a number of people asked that question. So let me do that, then we'll go back through some of these other points. And I'm going to plan to wrap up at about 1:15 Pacific, which will be 4:15 Eastern time. That will give us enough time to really delve into the rest. But for those that are unable to finish up the session, to answer the question of where you get copies, just simply go to www.healthcentscom/copy, and you'll be able to get your copies at the end of this session anytime you want. Just go there and you'll get it. And also, if you go back there in about 24 to 48 hours, you'll not only get a copy of the presentation, which is there now, but you also get a copy of this entire webinar. The recording itself will, the link to it will be there for you. The other thing, for those of you that are looking for CEU certification, I know that was one of the goals that some of you had. Deanna Wolf has been keeping track of, based on your enrollments, which organization you were looking for the certification from. And Deanna will get in touch with you within approximately 48 hours to get you your certificates, confirmations, depending on the organization you're with, so that you can go ahead and accrue the CEU credit for this session as well. For those that have indicated that you want CEU credit, we ask for the organization as well. So anyway, I will cover this once more at the end. And once again, if you want to ask questions at any point here, continue to send them to info@healthcentscom. So that should cover us on, for anybody that does need to leave a little bit early. Now, going back to where we are. So we've gotten through all this analysis, and that's great. Now, the other piece we need to combine is, how do we appropriately position our practice or company in the context of a payer contract negotiation? And we want to use what we call a SWOT analysis. So we want to kind of use a diagram here conceptually of identifying our strengths, our opportunities, our weaknesses, and our threats. Now, what kind of information might be of interest in a payer contract negotiation? Well, it could be that we work with certain large employer groups. Maybe, there's an IBM or an HP in our region, that type of thing. And, we get a lot of patients from those groups. So it's really important to those, to that relationship. And of course, the employer groups represent customers for the payers. So to the extent that, if we're in a difficult negotiation, that we can leverage those kinds of organizations or employer groups that our patients belong to, that they get their benefits from, that's going to help us. Do we have specialized services? And in particular, do those specialized services have a financial benefit? Means, do they have a preventative benefit, which is not only good for the patients, but it's a case where it's also good for the payer as well, because to the extent that the payer doesn't have to deal with hospital readmissions, for instance, that's going to be beneficial. Pay a few extra bucks to to avoid those sorts of outcomes. Value-based contracting. Do we have efficiency, qualitative and quantitative metrics? Are we using electronic health records, virtually 100% of the time? Do we, prescribe generics where possible versus brand names? Things of that nature can be rewarded. And then, looking at, weaknesses as well. Do we have other competing practices? Are we in a region where, we have, really lion's share of specialty services in our area? That's going to be a selling point. Well, the converse of that is, if we've got a lot of competition in the area, then we're going to have to differentiate, more in a value-based manner based on the services we provide. So, kind of look at all of these factors and then use that ultimately to put together a high-impact proposal letter. And now I'm going to show you, you can pretty much take this lock, stock, and barrel and build your own proposal letters. But the thing you want to do is keep them short. Big mistake here is, practices get, very proud of what they do, and that's a good thing, but it's not a good thing if you turn into a proposal letter that's 10 or 20 pages deep. So what you want to do is get to the point. establish a relationship. Why am I writing to you? Well, I'm writing you to request an increase for these reasons. What are the reasons? And then throw the hook. So let's look structurally at how that letter might look. So basically, you could, pretty much take this paragraph and make this your first paragraph and customize it. I'm writing to you on behalf of my practice to initiate a renegotiation. So it's pretty clear now why you're writing. So you want to do that just in this exact manner. Deductively means get to your conclusion first and then back it up with the facts. Often when we take English literature courses and things like that, we learn to write inductively. In this kind of a scenario, you want to write deductively. Get to the point and support it. Practice epitomizes an office-based paradigm. That's good, right? Because office-based means we're keeping services out of facilities. And we're the largest provider of services in the area. We've been in business for a long time, and we cover lots of lives, and it costs lots of dollars. So these are the kinds of facts you want to lead off with, okay? Then you get to what are some of the supporting facts, like second paragraph and third maybe, special procedures, extensive list of office-based procedures, have certain kinds of specialists here, etc. And we save a certain amount of money as a result of keeping this kind of work inside the office versus a hospital. And then, we get to the closing part that we want to, we stated positively, we want to remain in network, and we put together a reasonable fee schedule for doing that, which is the appendix. And then, very important, you want to put the payer on the hook. We need to hear from you by a certain date. And then immediately, 2-3 days after you send this letter out, you want to get back to the payer and, say, by the way, I sent you this a couple of days ago. Just want to be sure you have it. Any questions? You want to start that dialogue as early as possible. So get the proposal letter going. So now we pretty much have exhausted phase one. Now, don't worry. We're probably 70% of the way there. Now that we've gotten through the proposal letter, even though, the negotiation is just starting. But this is really where the goal is to extract an offer. And I would almost go as far as to say any offer is better than no offer. But you want to get through and get an offer as quickly as possible and iterate that negotiation until you get to success. And as mentioned, you want to get the payer on the hook, going to get back by a certain date. If they don't, and we try all these other techniques, value-based and so on, cost of living, etc., and none of it works, then and only then do you escalate. And if you can't get to result there, then, consider other options like your out-of-network options. But ultimately, once you get through a contract negotiation and get to agreement, don't forget to go back and monitor and renegotiate as well. So that's going to take you, the escalation kind of gets you through step 8, and then monitoring and renegotiate gets you all the way to step 10. So now I have a couple other things I want to share with you before we wrap. Very important is contract language. Now, reimbursement and the terms of the reimbursement are kind of the foundation of what's going to drive or not drive revenue, as the case may be, into your practice. But let's not forget about contract language. And what should we be looking for in our contracts to make sure that it doesn't negatively impact our operations, both in terms of reimbursement as well as in terms of our office procedures? Well, first is flexibility, term and termination. Ideally, make it 90 days without cause. Now, we see a lot of agreements nowadays that are basically renewed on an annual basis, and a lot of them will say that either party can terminate as long as they issue their termination notice within 90 days of the annual renewal date, which now means that you really should be tracking these agreements and what the renewal dates are, because if you wake up in the month of November and you say, shoot, I'm really not happy with my reimbursement from payer X, I need to renegotiate, but the annual anniversary date is in December. Well, now, unfortunately, you have to wait another year because it's only 1 month away at this point or less, the renewal date, and you had to have provided your notice 90 days or more. So make sure you know which agreements you have the ability to renegotiate, because if your past the date at which you're able to term, then you're going to have to most likely wait, because at this point the value in terms of your ability to negotiate is pretty much non-existent because you're locked in. And then there's some agreements that are very specific about the use of non-par providers. Well, be careful of this, because if you have an in-house lab, for example, providing certain overlapping services that maybe are subcontracted through one of these providers that they have a relationship with, you may have trouble relative to implementing your agreement. Timely submission of claims. Make sure that the dates and the amount of time that you have is going to work, both for submission and payments. I put some of the standards here. Make sure to address multilateral, bilateral procedures, retrospective reviews. Boy, I've seen cases where 3 years after an agreement is in place, all of a sudden they're going back to year one, and payers indicating that they overpaid back in year one. And unfortunately, it wasn't protected. The provider wasn't protected because they didn't have any limits on how far back retrospective reviews of overpayments could take place. So very important to make sure there's some fencing there, or you may have the unpleasant experience, which I've seen many times, of having to deal with audits and owing payers money many years after you've been paid. We talked about lesser of language, lesser bill charge versus contracted rate. Never, ever accept favored nation language. What does that mean? A favored nation, we're not talking about which nation's our favorite nation. We're talking about rate parity. What this means is that some payers basically put a clause in place that's, I'd say, less common today, but look for it, that says, we'll essentially, if you get lower, we'll pay you the rates agreed here, but among your other major payer agreements, if you have better rates, then if essentially the rates are lower on those agreements, then we would like you to then accept those lower rates for us as well. So basically the favored nation is for the payer to have the best of both worlds, where if another agreement is lower than theirs, then you'll agree to lower theirs. No way. And then changes to contracts. If there's substantive changes to a contract, that should give you flexibility. Means you get a notice from a large payer. It says, we're lowering your fee schedule by 10% effective January 1st. Well, at that point, there should be a clause correspondingly that says then, okay, we have the option to terminate now with a 30-day notice based on that substantive change to our fee schedule. So you want to have that kind of a clause in there. Also make sure that the performance-based metrics, where they're in your agreement, they often represent 5% or more of your reimbursement, that the metrics, the period of reconciliation and payment is understood. And then always, in any contract, not only look for the business terms, but make sure your legal counsel looks for any legal gotchas. That's why I highlighted that one. So language is important. Monitoring of claims. Again, line your agreements up. Do a comparison of your actual payments on specific codes to your contracted rates, and apply the volume that you do on that agreement, and basically look for underpayments and look for the magnitude. Now, in an ideal world, you'd see 0 in this delta column because your contracted rates would be matching the amount that you're actually paid. But, I've seen cases where as much as 20 to 25% discrepancies. So you don't necessarily have to have fancy tools that do real-time comparisons as claims are processed, but you should at least have a business process in place once a month for your top codes, where you randomly pick 5 or 6 or 10 claims, whatever you can manage, and average them out and do this kind of a comparison, because the point is, where there's smoke, there's fire. If you see that certain codes are substantially under reimbursed and others aren't, that's when you go digging deeper. Okay. ACOs, I'll just, for brevity here, say that ACOs are essentially vertically oriented organizations with a primary care physician, typically quarterback, and only able to belong to one ACO, but they combine complete treatment models. We see them emerging, obviously, from IPAs. We see them emerging from hospital systems, MSOs, PHOs, and the only, well, there's a couple things. You want to make sure that your fee schedules are such that you're not in some manner receiving less reimbursement because of participation in an ACO, because ACOs are then correspondingly contracted with both Medicare, Medicare Advantage, as well as commercial agreements. And you also want to make sure the metrics are understood, because of the bonus pools, have to collate data across all the treatment groups, and there needs to be an IT system in place to capture that, particularly if some of the treatment is happening outside of the ACO. So these are some of the factors to consider. I'll just point out that we have an article at healthcents.com/MGMA PDF that we wrote on this very topic for the MGMA, and recommend you take a look at it. Of course, there's also capitated models versus fee for service. All of that needs to be looked at. Value-based contracting point here is depending on the scenario. I pulled this from a Midwestern agreement recently, but commercial payers now are introducing value-based agreements, and often there's about a 5% upside beyond your fee for service. And some of the things that are looked at are generic drug utilization, best practices, e-prescribe, patient sat, all those kinds of factors can contribute, but make sure the measurement system is understood as well. In terms of key trends that are evolving, there, certainly the evolution of the ACOs, and one of the things that's happening is that there is a doc fix bill finally coming. Hopefully this will be the first year where we haven't had the with the MACRA, where you're going to get basically a 0.5% fee schedule adjustment for the N number of years, versus Congress having to vote every December to not give you a 20% decrease. Hopefully that will provide some degree of stability. You are having to have better systems in place to collect directly from individuals, from individual patients, because of the higher deductibles that we see on the exchange plans, for example. Telemedicine is gaining traction, and for that matter, being instituted as part of reimbursement. We talked about M&A acceleration and technology dependency. Be careful of these non-par referrals, or get exclusions built into your contracts if you need them, if you're doing ancillary services yourself. And often you will be rewarded for generics versus brand names, so make sure those goals are clearly spelled out as well. And if the payer's data is going to be the baseline, that may be okay, but definitely have a reconciliation period where you can go back and look at that. We are seeing the trend of shift going to more incentives versus and value-based versus straight fee for service. There is a definite trend, particularly for nationwide companies that are selling various services, to do credentialing in the state that they're in, and often have an in-state presence. So, if you're a DME provider and you plan to sell your products, in Arkansas, it may be that a particular large payer in the state of Arkansas is going to require that you actually have a location in Arkansas to get your credentialing completed, for example. Interestingly, while there's been some experimentation with bundled payments for joint replacement, IVF in the case of obstetrics and so forth, it's still, not, it's hard to nail this one down, probably because there's, this whole episode of care is very hard to get a consistent metric on and manage the risk on, both for the payer and for the provider. So still not seeing a lot of this. More what we're seeing is now more of a value-based component to agreements and bonus pool upside versus straight bundled payments. And then number of cores that Medicare will pay for example, for biopsies used to be 12, and often now it's less. And anyway, listed some of the other trends and directions here as well. I'll skip past it, let you read it later, and then summarize here by saying that what we've conveyed here are 10 best practices. And again, I'd like you to think about this in the context of preparation and spending at least 50% of your time, and hopefully all the analytics that I showed you earlier in the session demonstrate why this whole set of steps is critical to your success in the negotiation. You know, the 20/80 rule, sorting out your codes based on revenue importance, doing the weighted average technique, the SWOT analysis, getting a good, concise proposal letter. Those are all the, you know, the fundamentals to successful negotiations. And then you engage in the negotiations, and again, rule of thumb, do not escalate until you have made your best effort to come to conclusion at the lower levels of the organization, because you take away your negotiating power if you do. We talked about contract language, what to look for, and again, monitoring those payments to ensure accuracy. Now, a couple of final notes. Susan Charkin, my partner and co-owner of Healthcents Inc., is conducting half-hour assessments, no cost, no obligation, to clients that attend, or customers that attend these sessions, and she wants to help you to assess your upside on contracts. So her information is here. You can certainly reach out to her if you'd like. And additionally, you can at any point reach me or send an email to info@healthcents.com. I see all of those as well. Those I mentioned before that want copies, go to www.healthcents.com/copy to get your copies, and also to get a complete recording. And the CEU certification should be coming your way without you having to do anything within the next 48 hours from Deanna. But if you have any questions, you can reach out to her on that topic. Before we conclude, Regina, are there any final questions today?
I do not have any more questions at info.
Okay, then with that, why don't you open up the lines one more time, give folks a last opportunity for those that stuck around, do an asterisk 43. Okay, if you'd like to ask a final question, please press *6, happy to answer it. And with that then, we will conclude this session, and I want to thank all of you for your participation today, and very happy to have you obtain copies at the location here as well. So thank you for your attendance, and good luck negotiating your contracts. Have a great afternoon. Goodbye now.